Good evening, and welcome back to Voices of Hope's Winter Speaker Series. My name is Gail Temkin, and as Voices of Hope Vice President, I am honored to introduce tonight's speaker, Mehnaz Afridi. Dr. Afridi is the director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College, as well as an associate professor of religious studies. Her religion is what has informed her career in Holocaust and genocide education, and the scholarship she has contributed to the field is now world-renowned. I have a unique connection to Dr. Afridi's work at Manhattan College. As many of you know, my father, Abby Weiner, of blessed memory, survived the greatest horrors of the Holocaust as a boy. He survived Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Yavishevitz, and Buchenwald, where he was liberated. After liberation, my father went to London and met his forever best friend, Herman Ziering. They came to the United States and led a beautiful life of love and integrity. It was through the generosity of his children who lent my father Uncle Herman's concentration camp uniform to be displayed at the University of Hartford's Museum of Jewish Civilization, which many of you saw on display before it was moved to its new location at Manhattan College's Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Center. My cousin Debbie, who's on the call tonight, had an extensive Holocaust library from her father that she knew was valuable for study. When she sent out emails to local colleges, Dr. Afridi jumped at the opportunity. She's so passionate about what she does and wanted to have the library accessible to academics and students for study. Dr. Afridi is an advocate for human rights for all races and religions and uses the Holocaust as a lesson for the world to prevent any future genocides. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Afridi here tonight to share her important work with all of you. After her presentation, we will have a little time for questions, so be sure to send your questions through the chat function to Robin Landau at the bottom of your screen. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Mehnaz Afridi.
Thank you so much, Gail. And Mehnaz, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are so excited to have you here. I thought we would start with, if you could just tell us a little bit about your background and how you were raised.
Sure. I just want to thank Gail so much. And I was so happy that she came to the opening. I see Debbie Ziering down there. And Robin, thank you so much. We've been talking for quite some time back and forth. And I really appreciate the work that you do at Voices for Hope. And I think that for me, just being here, just being with you can perhaps shed a different lens on how we see and perceive the world. And I think that's what you're trying to do as well, is to educate through your wonderful programs, and especially with survivor testimony. So I really appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go back to Robin's question. So I want to say Assalamu alaikum, shalom, and peace be upon all of you. I hope you had a good Purim, although it was probably not so much fun as usual, because I've spent some time with my friends, Jewish friends, celebrating Purim too. So I was born in Pakistan, and my family moved from place to place after I was about 6 years old. And so we lived in Western Europe, in places like Geneva, Switzerland, London, all the lovely places, Zurich, Switzerland. And then we moved to the Middle East, and then we came to New York. So my own background was with many cultures, multilingual, and at home we always spoke Urdu, which is my native tongue, and we were practicing Muslims always. However, being a child back in like the late 70s and early 80s, being very young and growing up in these wonderful schools in Europe, it seemed to be that I was always with the Jews and the Hindus, and the rest were the kind of masses, right? So there was a sort of othering that already occurred in my life that I wasn't very conscious of, because you're a child and you sort of go through it. And I was just remembering today that when we lived in Geneva, Switzerland, a van would pick my brother and I up to take us to school. And on that van, I was teased about being brown, or the word for female genitals would come up that I didn't know. And there were a lot of things that made me feel, okay, there must be something different about me being a Muslim. However, in places like London, I was best friends with a young, she was my age, 8 or 9 years old, and we were best friends. We would spend Hanukkah together at her house. She was Russian Orthodox, and she would come to my house, and we would spend iftar, the breaking of a fast during Ramadan, with each other. So for me, being with someone who was of different religion was never really a surprise. And my parents were very open with having me go and come with Jewish friends, Christian friends, secular, Hindus. It didn't matter, because we all thought of each other as being human, and that's something that Islam teaches us as a social justice lesson throughout my upbringing, and also when I teach Islam. So languages and traditions shaped who I was, and I have to say, when you're that young and you're moving every 2 or 3 years, it's very hard. I mean, my daughter is just going into high school, and she's traumatized because she's been in this one school, and I'm like, listen, you have no idea what this means. There's a lot of change and transformation in one's life. But in retrospect, it was one of the biggest gifts that my parents gave me, probably not knowing what I would end up doing in my life. But it was a gift that I can in certain say that everybody has to experience in some ways, which is people's idea of culture is, so monolithic that mine was completely broken from the beginning. I also had the wonderful opportunity of spending summers in Pakistan with my extended family. My family still lives in Pakistan as we speak. My mother's there, and I hope to see her in July. It's been really difficult having your mother so far away. So I had this kind of home, which I call Pakistan, because my first cousins were there. My whole family was there. We would go there for 3 months, kind of like a summer camp, but it was actually in Pakistan. And so I was living between all of these different cultures. And I always was changing languages and thinking about how to sort of look at my own identity. But at home, we were very much Muslim, practicing. My parents struggled to find places for Eid and our Ramadan prayers, because in places like Zurich, there were no mosques and things like that. So we always had that kind of identification of being Muslim, but also this openness in our house. So when I moved to the Middle East, I was sort of in shock, because in the Middle East, I moved to Dubai. I went to Shoah, which was actually a Lebanese-based school that moved to Dubai after the war with Israel. And I experienced that there were no Jews. It was just Christians and Muslims at the school. And I thought that was kind of strange, because I was always raised with, all kinds of people, especially Jews, in these schools. And the one thing that really, I think, turned my mind, and I talk about in my book, is that supervisors would come into our classroom and they would block the word Israel and Jew out of our textbooks. And I would turn around to my friends and I said, why are they doing this? And they said, well, just ignore them. They do this every year. They're just stupid. And that's sort of like just kind of a passing comment that went by. But for me, it stuck with me. It became sort of a question I had. I asked my mother, and she said, you can't change the curriculum. So she was like, oh no, you're always like trying to change things. So then after the Middle East, I moved to Scarsdale, New York, where I was predominantly Jewish American at that time, back in the early 90s. And I joined a soccer team where I was not treated very nicely by my Jewish friends. And my parents got a lot of phone calls harassing them to move out of the area because they were Muslim. And I got very confused. So I started to ask myself these questions, like, what is going on here? Why is this animosity? What I'd experienced in the Middle East and I was experiencing in the United States. And then I went to Syracuse University, where I did a BA in religious studies, English lit, and also psychology. And then I ended up going for my master's, where I studied with Dr. Alan Berger. I was his TA, who does Holocaust studies. And when I was a TA for him, his class it wasn't as if I didn't have Holocaust studies, but I think this is the problem, that a lot of students, even to this day, are studying it like it's a black and white story, it's past, you know. They don't really absorb it. And when I started to TA for him, it really blew my mind in terms of the detail of the Holocaust and how far it had gone in such a actually short time, if you think about it, and how it had impacted world Jewry itself. And then Alan Berger saw my passion and my compassion and my interest in the Holocaust, and he said to me, Mehnaz, why don't you go to Israel? And I said, I can't go to Israel. I have a Pakistani passport. He said, oh, don't worry about that. I'm gonna arrange for you to go. And I did. I went to Hebrew University for 5 weeks and studied biblical archaeology there. And I thought, as a young person, that I was going to solve the problems, right? And bring peace to everyone and find out whose land this was. Of course, I was wrong. But my experience being in Jerusalem and also in Palestinian territories was incredible. And I came back feeling like, oh, wow, you know, Palestinians and Israelis really want the same thing, which is peace, security, and a life that they can live in safety. And then after that, I worked with Michael Birnbaum on certain projects, but I ended up getting my PhD at the University of South Africa in Islamic literature. So I basically have 2 different scholarships that I've done. One is the Holocaust and one is Islam, which is 2 very unlikely sort of pairings that people would want to see. But in a sense, it's really helped me think about things differently and actually educate our students that are Catholic, mainly at Manhattan College, and also our Muslim students, which I'm the advisor for, about Judaism, but also about Islam and how the 2 function in a way. So this is sort of my journey into the Holocaust, and also my real sort of understanding. I mean, I don't think many people just sit down and study the Holocaust in the way that I did, and I don't think many people really care to understand the kind of enormity of the Holocaust. And in my book, I have a chapter which is the Holocaust is unprecedented, and I kind of make a case of why it's unprecedented. It's not in the sense of completely unique, but it's unprecedented, and I can talk about that further if you want, Robin. Can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, I would love to hear more about that. But before we get there, you talk a little bit about your background in Islam and in Holocaust. And I know that you have that part of your work involves building bridges between the Muslim and the Jewish communities. And can you talk a little bit about how what you do at Manhattan College and with the center, and how your work with the Holocaust helps build those bridges?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I think of in terms of building bridges is 1 is education, 2 is activism, and 3 is community work. Those are the 3 ways that I really believe that we can build bridges. We've done projects at the center where we've taken Jewish teens from a local synagogue and my Catholic students to a mosque in Parkchester, Bronx, where we refurbished a synagogue inside of the mosque. I know this sounds bizarre, but you can Google it and look it up. And what happened was that there was a community of Jews in Parkchester, and the rabbi had moved to Brooklyn, and he used to actually walk from Brooklyn to Parkchester on Shabbat and hold these services for these few Jews that were left in Parkchester. And the imam of the mosque, Sheikh Drama, wanted to give him that space because he couldn't afford any other space. So the students, the 3, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, all worked on this and painted together. And then we had a barbecue. And what's interesting is, you know, kids are kids. And they would just sit there and just talk about each other's iPhones or whatever the games they were playing. But it was a moment where they understood that it doesn't matter. You're still interested in the same things. You're still young. You're still in this culture together. And there was a sharing that was really important, even if they didn't read text together, even if they weren't academic. And I think that's part of how we get people to talk to each other. It's to see the fact that we are all human, that we have those human needs. And especially with the young kids and the students that I work with, they start to realize this. Even, you know, when we're looking at social justice and racial justice in classes, there's a certain kind of organic way where people stop to other each other. If you give them a project to work on, if you give them something to think about, and if you're an active person. So also, in terms of the center, we've done some advocacy for the Rohingya genocide, the Uyghur genocide recently. Elliot Engel's office is in Riverdale, so it's very easy for me, was very easy for me to go and visit him and rally for these things. And I would take Muslim students and Jewish students and Catholic students together. So doing that work together and advocating in a political office is really important, especially as Americans. The other wonderful project that I did with the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale was to have the students there work with my students and a survivor in the community. So we had, you know, a Jewish student at HIR who was a little older, a Catholic student from my school, or sometimes Muslim students from Manhattan College, and a survivor. It was incredible because here you had 3 different generations, 3 very varied socioeconomic backgrounds and ages, and races sometimes, right? So there was this incredible, and what they would do is visit the survivor. I would first go with them. We would come up with some questions, and then they would visit the survivor and start to find out who they were. And honestly, for the survivors, they loved it because they had books out and they were like talking, and it was like they were giving a class to these students. And they loved the fact that they had women in hijab in their house interested in this material. So for me, that was so important in terms of creating something that nobody would think about, putting all these pieces together in a way that became really important to all of the 3 that were involved in this project.
Great, thank you. So there's so much information about the Holocaust, and like you said, there's so many
every day I learn more. Yes.
Me too. That's what I've said since I started here. Every day I learn more. But some of the stories that are not as well known are the stories of the Muslim, some of the Muslim people rescuing some of the Jewish people during the Shoah. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So I also adjunct sometimes at Gratz College, which is Holocaust and Genocide Studies. They get a master's or PhD. And one of the classes I've created there, and I actually have taught at Manhattan too, but this is a higher level, is Muslims and the Holocaust. And we look at North Africa specifically, which was occupied by France for a long time, but became the Vichy government under the Nazi regime. And what blows the minds of my PhD students, that's why I bring them up, is that they had never ever heard of this, had no idea what was going on. But what it does is also informs people of the Jewish and Muslim history in North Africa, right? Mm-hmm. How Jews lived there, but there was also anti-Semitism, how the laws changed under the Vichy government, and also how Tunisians rescued Jews because there were camps in North Africa. Very few people know about that. And Robert Satlov has done wonderful work on that, a book he's written, Among the Righteous Nations. He wanted to build bridges between Jews and Arabs by looking at this rescue story. One of the most important stories about rescue is Albania. Albania is 70% Muslim and 30% Christian. Albania not only rescued all of its Jews during World War II, but also rescued Jews that came across the border that they hid. So it was the only European country in the world to do that for Jews. There are stories about Inayat Nur Khan, who was an Indian woman. She was half British, half Indian, but she was a Muslim that was working for the British as a spy. and she was killed in Dachau because somebody found out that she was working for the Allies. There's a story about Khalid ibn Wahed, who was from Tunisia, that hid people in his farm while he tried to scurry away the SS guards and change the names of the families that he sheltered. And that also can be found. There was also the Iranian Schindler, as the book is called, and this is Mokhtari Sardar. I've displayed him in the center. Debbie's seen it, and I think Gail has too, in the rescue case, because I think it's so important for us to see different people being involved. And what he did was he tried to change the fact that Jews were Semitic, and came up with this notion of the mosaic, and rescued about 50 people during the Holocaust. Then you had a Turkish diplomat, Ultaman Sahakaktit, that also rescued Jews, and he was a diplomat. He could change papers, he could change names, he could do all kinds of things. So there's a lot of these stories of connectedness, right? I mean, I think the most beautiful story for me, and I'd go to Sarajevo quite a lot because I work on also Bosnian genocide, and I'm doing a new project about memory and Muslim genocide and war. But one of the most beautiful stories that you can read about is the woman in Sarajevo. So the family, a Jewish family during World War II, was being persecuted by the fascists, the Nazis, and a Muslim family rescued them. And story fast forward, in 1992, the Bosnians were being massacred, and the Jewish community remembered and saved that Muslim family. I mean, that's an incredible story in terms of memory and what we remember, what we choose to remember, what we choose to forget is a very important thing in the line of work that I do, even in terms of looking at Muslim history and what we remember, what we like to repress, how we like to erase things. So that's one of the things that I think is really important for us to think about. And you know, I'm very open and honest as a Muslim woman that one of the reasons I wrote this book and the reasons that I wanted to talk about the Holocaust is there was so much distortion in the Muslim and Arab world and lack of education. And I think most Muslims have received my book really well because it's not an angry book. It's like, okay, guys, we need to put this on paper as Muslims and acknowledge this and have no distortion and no denial about it. And I think that is the most important thing we can do for each other, not as a Muslim to a Muslim, but from a Muslim to a Jew and vice versa. To speak up for one another is I think, so much more important, and people listen to it more than if I were just talking about my community and my community's victimization.
Right. How has the response, well, you talked a little bit about the response in the Muslim world, but how has the response been to you in the Jewish world?
You know, it's I think it's interesting. It's been positive, I think, on both Muslim and Jewish. I think it's interesting if people really come and want to understand the kind of work I do and don't have a misperception or a perception of their own. It doesn't have to be a misperception of, you know, say what the Quran says or, you know, who Muslims are. I mean, I think it's so important for us to educate each other, and that becomes troublesome, right? When I took on this position, I mean, can you imagine seeing an advertisement for this position in the newspaper and going, and my friend sent it to me and I said, don't mess with my head, you're lying to me. Right? They were looking for a Islamic scholar to head a Holocaust center at a Catholic college. Yeah. Amazing, right? And, you know, people always say, how did you get the job? I said, well, I just couldn't believe it. It was almost like God sent it for me. And I really, honestly, in my heart and my soul, believe that. And it may sound absurd to some, but I do believe that. And when I took the job, there was a lot of pushback against me, especially from the Jewish community, because there was no trust, right? So a lot of people said, well, how can we trust a Muslim to carry the memory of the Holocaust, or all she will do is talk about Palestine, or, you know, might as well hire a neo-Nazi. So I think it hurt me. But today, those people that had a problem have been quoted in many places saying, if we had more people like Dr. Afridi, it would have been better. So it takes time. It's not about me. It takes time to build that trust between communities. I understand why there was pushback, but it takes a lot of time and nurturing and care. And you have to be very, very sensitive to what kind of knowledge you're holding and how you hold it, and be very gentle and courageous about it. Otherwise, it can be very problematic. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of what happens on campuses when the leadership sucks, honestly. When people don't say, hey, don't bring in that Muslim speaker because they sound anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic, or don't bring in that, Jewish speaker because they sound Islamophobic. And you have to sort of educate students of why that's important, and not to shut them down, but say, why is that important? Are we here to, agitate each other? Are we here actually to build a community of critical thinking? And that's, I think that's so important in terms of the work that we do at Manhattan College.
It's amazing. It really is. I wish it's amazing. And I know you do a lot of work with Holocaust survivors. How have the survivors responded to your work, and can you tell us a little bit about what you do with them?
Okay, so whenever I think of interviewing survivors, I think of this wonderful woman, Alana Samuel. She works at the Museum of Tolerance, and she was the one who got me all the interviews because she wanted to make sure they were okay with being interviewed by me. For some of them, it was the first time they spoke to a Muslim woman. And it was probably the most important year or two of my life, interviewing survivors. It was not easy because listening to their stories, you can't sleep at night. And my daughter was just born, so it was just very weird having this kind of experience. But I'm going to show you a clip, if that's okay, of
course.
And you'll recognize some of them because I got very lucky. I interviewed Renee Firestone and Robert Clary, who was the French lieutenant in Hogan's Heroes. So, and he was very kind of upset with me because he's very secular and has rejected religion, and I haven't. So I just want you to watch this because I think it's interesting to see. Just in terms of, let's see, that's not working. Huh. Okay, we're good.
You're good? Okay, good.
Do you know many Muslims? Have you talked to Muslims?
No, I wish I would. Because for me, it doesn't matter. You are Muslim, you are a human being. I love people. Mm-hmm. When I speak, I never ever think about that it's Muslim or Catholic or Protestant or whatever. Mm-hmm. I just see a human being, and that's the way I was raised, actually.
Mm-hmm. What is your main message to Muslims about the Holocaust?
I don't know if anyone completely understands what happened there. Mm-hmm. I mean, what happened, that's true. Mm-hmm. Why that did happen and the whole world was looking at and didn't do anything, that's one thing I don't understand. Mm-hmm. But one thing I understand, that we should all like each other, talk to each other, and try to understand each other.
Talking to you, I forget that you are Muslim today.
Yes.
Okay, I totally forget that, but.
But that's good. We shouldn't look at our.
I know.
That's
but
precisely the point of this practice.
I know. I realize that the question I have for the Muslims: do you really believe that any paper we sign is going to have an effect on the children that you teach to kill? That's the question I want to ask.
Okay, perfect question. The gas chambers especially are seen by a lot of people as a fabrication. As difficult as it is for me to ask you this, could you perhaps shed light on that from your perspective?
Well, you know, only a totally ignorant human being would say today that it didn't happen. I don't have the right to forgive. It's not my job to forgive. God is the only one that can forgive. I only have to remember and be aware all the time of what can happen. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I try to do my job.
Okay.
Like you are doing yours. Have you been threatened?
Have I been threatened? Yes.
I'm sure.
As a Muslim, yes. Both in my community and outside of my community.
I'm sure.
So, I mean, I also spend a lot of time, Renee, going to Jewish temples
Mm-hmm.
and showing similarities of justice between Judaism and Islam.
I don't care what color, what creed, what you do in life, as long as you're a decent person. That's enough for me. Now let me ask you a question. Are you a religious Muslim?
I believe, yes.
You believe.
faith.
You believe you believe there's somebody upstairs who's going to guide your life, who's going to make you a better person.
I don't think that person is going to make me a better person, but I think there's something there that is not guiding me.
Then you go through your life with rules, the rules that the Muslims are giving you. Is that what it is? I'm asking you. I'm not judging you. I'm asking you a question.
No, I don't go with the rules that
Because a
are
lot
given.
of people do that,
Right.
including the Jewish religion.
If a Muslim is watching, what do you want to say to them?
I say, get an education. Learn about life. Don't be in your little sphere only, and just don't see anybody else but yourself. And if you do that, if you get educated, maybe you will have a better chance in this world.
So there's stories that were told during Muhammad's life in the 6th century. Jihad means struggle.
Okay.
So jihad has several connotations. One is holy war. Not direct translation, but the result is holy war, which means if someone comes to your house and forces you and your family out or kills you, you have the right to defend yourself with struggling against them through jihad. However, it doesn't mean that you kill them. The Holocaust is unique, right? Holocaust was not just in Germany, it was in Poland, it was in Czech, it was in Italy, it was all over, it was in Tunisia. So the whole point of the Holocaust was to exterminate Jews off the face of the earth. I don't care if someone wants to sit there and deny it, they can do it till they're blue in the face. Okay, I hope that everyone saw it, right? You could see it?
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So it's really interesting and very impressive how you are able to have these difficult conversations with people and do it with such grace. Has that gotten any easier over time?
You know, it's been such a weird few years for us here in this country, that it's been difficult because we Muslims had to also go through the Muslim ban and all of that sort of fear of being completely othered in the United States. And I remember my daughter was younger. My God, she was like 9, and she's going to high school now because it was, it started off in 2014 and it started off in 2015. And of course, it became the 7 country ban. But I remember because I wasn't born here. I mean, I'm an American citizen, but because I wasn't born here, she was petrified. So every time I take her to school, she'd say, "Mama, are they going to deport you?" And I said, "No, sweetheart, they can't take me away." I think she'll be fine because I'm constantly having conversations with her about all kinds of things. But I think it's really hard for any kid. I mean, for example, growing up in Europe and being othered, because I wasn't Christian or I wasn't white. I mean, these are questions that we want to think about our kids, because our kids now, that Muslim ban was her first instant. She's an American, right? Born in California. Her father's from California. And she was for the first time put in a box. And that, I hope that many Muslim children will learn how to negotiate that box and not to see themselves always boxed up. And I think these are the moments that are really important for us, and why rhetoric is so important. I mean, propaganda was huge during the Holocaust, right? I mean, I talk to my students about that all the time. We talk about, politicians' rhetoric all the time. But I think that's so important. And we think our kids are on their, games or whatever, or online, but they really do listen. And we forget that. And I think it's time for us to understand that they're not just completely, off the radar, but they're listening to what we have to say. And teaching for me is so nurturing, because I'm always with young people, but I'm also listening to how they're feeling about the environment. And a lot of them are desensitized because they feel hopeless. They feel like they don't want to do anything because nothing changes, nothing transforms. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and you have to have a lot of energy to do it. And just the other day, I was talking to my students. I was teaching Brian Stevenson, who's amazing. I don't know if you've read him, but he did the book Just Mercy, and he advocates for incarcerated young black males. And he also opened up the Memorial Museum, which is colloquially called the Lynching Museum in Alabama. So he's amazing. And I said to my white male students that if you can't have a conversation in this classroom with the minority students, then you can't ever do it, right? I mean, and it's one of those things where I think the more and more I'm listening to people and my colleagues, and it's like this division is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think we need to bring it in the middle somehow and somewhere. And I think this is why I'm so passionate about Jewish-Muslim relations, because I think that, there's so many divisions politically amongst us, so many misperceptions, right, from all sides, that we need to have voices that say, hey, okay, let's stop and let's think of our history, and maybe our history in different times. I teach a lot about colonial history in the Muslim world, which I say to my Jewish audiences, please learn something about that, because it was a very wounding experience for most of us. And then I tell my Muslim audiences, please learn not just about the Holocaust, but even pre-Holocaust. Learn about the history of anti-Semitism that has been going on and on and on. One of the first racializations of the other was anti-Semitism. It wasn't against black people, which is very interesting, but it's true. So if you start to have these conversations in a way, but you're not necessarily always representing your own identity and tradition, it's challenging, but I think it can have transformations, and I've seen young people transform because of it. And I'm going to stop there because I think people might have questions.
Yeah, we're starting to get some questions in. One more. We have one more quick thought. Can you talk just for a minute or so about what it is in your Islamic belief that I know you have said or have read that it's your Islamic beliefs that inform your interest in the Holocaust? And could you talk a little bit just about what that is?
Sure. I mean, there are different levels of it. The first thing is that in the Quran, we're told that we're made from the same thing, which is earth, and equally male and female, and everybody is made that way. In the Quran, we're told that the Jews had the first message from God, and then the Christians. In the Quran, we're told not to stand by when people lie about others, especially those that are believers. And even if you go against your own community, you should stand up for justice. That is very important for me. Quran also talks about difference and nations and tribes. The Quran also talks about the idea that we are all humanity, that we should not differentiate between each other. And Prophet Muhammad's last sermon before he died was about egalitarianism and not to differentiate between Arab and non-Arab, black and white. So for me, I think teaching the Holocaust, it's a lesson about humanity. It's a lesson about humanity that is very deep, and it's very, very hard because we start to realize that human beings are capable of anything. You know, when they create mythological ideas about other people. And that is a lesson that we all need to learn. And we've done that with other races and other religions and other groups, but never to the scale where I'm telling you about North Africa, right? Or, you know, another survivor I interviewed, Albert Rosa, he was on Rhodes Island in Greece. You know, and when he was, he actually built parts of Birkenau himself, and I mean, his story is also amazing. It's in my book, but I never got a written permission from his daughter, so I couldn't publish all of his testimony. But I mean, these incredible stories, and then the fact that survivors are talking to you, and they are really doing the work of God by talking against hate. I mean, look at that courage. That's just a small example of what we can learn from people after they've suffered tremendous blows for just being Jewish.
Thank you. Thank you. We do have some questions that are coming in. From Lois and Alan Berkowitz, Michelle Abipol, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Robert Satloff, essays in Omar Bohm's and your wonderful book discuss how Muslims and Jews live together across the Maghreb. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that either. I'm sorry. Can you talk a little bit about what has separated these communities and how we repair the divide?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, you know, I mean, that's a big question, but I can kind of do a little bit with it. Okay, so I think it's important for Arabs to recognize that Jews actually migrated out of the Maghreb, 700,000 of them. I write about that in my book myself because I think that's an important moment. And, you know, the narrative of like they went voluntarily is actually inaccurate. A lot of them were pushed out. There was fear because it was after 1948. A lot of the migration took place in the 50s and later on. The second thing we can do is be honest about our history, right, and what happened. The other thing is to understand colonization over Arab land. Very important. And how Jews and Arabs were pitted against each other. I mean, this is part of what I'm teaching in my PhD class, and my students are kind of like, wow. So Jews are given citizenship, Arabs are not. Then Jews are they take away the citizenship from Jews, and then Arabs are, you know, given. I mean, it's just a very complex situation. Morocco was different. Algeria was different. Tunisia was different. Libya was different. And the fact that Nazis were not directly there, except for in Libya, is very interesting because the Vichy were even more brutal with the people in these camps. The other thing we can do is talk about how Jews and Muslims did indeed live together peacefully, and look at this kind of renaissance of culture, which started actually in the 12th century in Iraq, where they were translating each other's texts and looking, I mean, they were translating texts that the Christians were burning, because in Jewish and Muslim tradition, we are inclined to science. We are inclined to thinking. We're inclined to be curious. It was not a sin to translate Plato into Arabic or Hebrew. So these are things to celebrate and also look at and say, wow, How come we were able to do that together, right? The other thing is we have to look at, places like Spain and what happened in Spain and why both Muslims and Jews were actually exterminated. There was always this notion of the Oriental, right? Jews and Muslims were also seen Oriental in a way from the Christian empire. And I don't want to make Christians the bad kind of people. We all have cycles, historical cycles, where we're all bad. Even the Muslim empire and was brutal in many, many ways. So I think if we are honest about our history, there are some real nuggets about our cooperation, and there's some real challenges that we have to look at. And the one lesson that I always say to my Muslim audiences is Jews left the Arab world. Why? Right? Why in such masses, and why was this exodus? And look at Iraq, for example. In Morocco, you still have at least a push for Holocaust education. You still have a protecting of the synagogue, but in a lot of places, it's not like that. In Karachi, where I was born, we have no longer any Jews. However, I think there are crypto Jews, right? Jews that are hiding from being known as Jews. Why? Why are they hiding? Because they would be discriminated against. These are the facts, and I want us to be honest about these facts, because then we're never going to heal. We're always going to stay in this divide where, one is more victim than the other, and that's not what it's about. It's about understanding and being self-critical, because in Islam, just like in Judaism, you can't hide anything from God. God is all-knowing, all-powerful, right? And we human beings are minuscule, and we live in our little boxes, and God says to us, you're not even as smart as you think you are, and you will always stay in that way. So I think of akhirat, right? When we die, that I will be naked in front of God, and I mean that not physically, but just everything about me. That if I feel injustice, then I should stand up, and that's another way that Islam motivates me.
Thank you. Here's a question from Ali Gammo. She says, I have come across Jewish parents of teenagers who have gone through Voices of Hope's programming at the University of Hartford, which includes survivor testimony and visiting a museum discussing refugees. And on more than one occasion, a parent has objected to her trying to, quote, bridge an understanding between the Holocaust and what is happening in our world now. Have you encountered situations like that, and how would you handle it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that, in genocide studies, we have this sort of thing called Olympics of suffering, where it becomes problematic that everybody, has, and I do believe that we can take lessons from the Holocaust and apply some of them, but I think having a complete stark comparison is not fair, nor is it accurate scholarly wise. But I think that to say, and I know survivors that I work with that were talking about Syrian refugees and saying this is exactly where we were during World War II. Nobody wanted us. And there are parallels that we can make and we can talk about, but it's not a precise comparison. And it's okay to use some tools from different instances to talk about. I mean, people compare, like they say Rwanda, how many people died in 1 month, 300,000 with a machete. I mean, in a way, that's like crazy, right, when you think about it. But again, I think it's important to give each culture its own voice, but as an educator, you can use lots of tools that are historical tools or critical tools. There are testimonies and stories that inform young people. There are so many great documentaries, different ways of thinking about how we think of racism today. So I think that a complete analysis is not always welcome. That's all.
Thank you. And we did have a question about the name of your book, and I will tell everybody the name of your book is Shoah Through Muslim Eyes. And we're going to put up a link in the chat where you can purchase the book. So keep a lookout for that in the chat. And we have a question. Could you explain the concept of the infidel, and are there rules that apply to one who is infidel?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was just telling, I'm teaching the Quran in my senior seminar to the juniors and seniors, and I'm having so much fun. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but it is fun because they've never read the Quran, and I'm having fun listening to them tell me how they're feeling about it. And a lot of them are Catholic, some are secular. There's one half Jewish kid in my class, and they're amazed at how it speaks to Jews, how it speaks to Christians, how it speaks to Sabians, and then it kind of says, oh, well, these people went astray, right? So the infidel is really not a person who is against the religion. It's the unbeliever, the non-believer. And a lot of the times, infidel is more of a crusade word. But it's not really an Islamic word. The unbeliever is a person who turns away from God, and that's one requirement of Islam, is to believe in the one God. If there's anything that I can tell you about Islam, is to believe in the one God, the unknowable and merciful, beneficial God. So that's how I would, and I just did this with my students because they had that impression that, oh, if you're an infidel, you can kill them. There's no such thing in the Quran. There are more verses of peace and justice, and unfortunately Muslims are the victims of these extremists that use these literal verses against people like us. So you know, this is always problematic about sacred text. It's always very hard to teach sacred text. It's very hard to defend sacred text. So I'd rather just not and say, this is what it is. What are we going to do with it? That's the question we need to ask ourselves as Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, whatever. What are we going to do with this? How are we going to be taking the message of the full Quran or the Torah or the Bible and look at this verse? Is this what God wants?
Thank you. And if you could leave us with a message, and I think you've said this, but a message that you really want to leave with your students, if you could share that message with us, what would that be?
I think ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I think that's lacking in our culture in a lot of ways. And I think some of it is because people are fearful, and there's political correctness, and there's all kinds of stuff. But that's why I said to you earlier, I tell my students, this is, if you can't do it here, then forget it. You know? And I said, you know, even if you offend someone in this classroom, let's talk about that, and let's get that in the room, because it's not about, it shouldn't be about us and them. It shouldn't be about this division that we've created. So ask questions, critical questions, and I think they will lead you so far. And it's amazing. And what you will find out about the world when you ask critical questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I apologize if we did not get to everybody's questions, but our time was limited. And Mehnaz, this has really been an incredible hour. So
thank you for having me, everyone.
And I'm going to throw it over to Gail.
Mehnaz, thank you so much. This was such a unique and informative talk tonight. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Gail. Good to see you.
Yes, nice to see you too. And thank you to everyone in our audience for your engagement and spectacular questions. You can learn more about Dr. Afridi's work by visiting the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education website found in the chat. If you liked tonight's program and want to see more from us, consider making a donation at www.ctvoicesofhope.org. Use our text to give number, and you can even find us on Venmo. All of the ways to donate tonight are listed in the chat box. Before you go, next Monday, March 8th, we are welcoming author Ruth Rutkowitz at 7 p.m., who will speak to us about her book, Escaping the Whale. This will be another remarkable conversation, so be sure to register at the link in the chat. All of our upcoming speakers are listed on our website at www.ctvoicesofhope.org. While you're there, check out all of the Voices of Hope educational and commemorative programs, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for the latest updates and much more. Thank you again, and have a good night.